The religion of the Middle Ages was very public and objective because the language of faith shaped the very fabric of the perceived world. Faith and knowledge were held together. Now, Pascal was a Catholic believer, but in his day, faith and knowledge were beginning to come apart. As he says, God is known by the heart, not by the reason, almost as if he means that his own religion was feeling expressed in biblical metaphors. Reason told him that our knowledge of the world has to be put in the language of number, and rule, and mechanism. And that's the problem of the sea of faith. And that's why we began as far back as Galileo. Faith postulates a personal control of events, a moral providence, unseen presences and powers, divine interventions. But over the centuries, our growing scientific knowledge has always excluded such ideas. The result has been to leave the language of faith out on a limb, dissociated, and therefore of uncertain meaning. It's gradually lost descriptive force and social authority. No age was so overwhelmingly dominated by the idea of the mechanical universe as the 19th century. Assuming that natural forces are predictable and controllable, they harnessed the elements of fire and air and water. They mechanized society too, with capitalism, double-entry bookkeeping, bureaucracy and statistics. Yet in their religion, they were content simply to step back into the medieval world. And it's no use asking how could they do it, because we do just the same. Our theories, like our machines, may be getting less ponderously mechanical, but we describe our world in terms of number more than ever. Modern physics, modern electronics, and yet in this century, we flock to nativity plays and carol services. It's as if the supernatural and the mythical still casts a spell over us. We need to turn to it to counterbalance the worldview of modern science. Angels bending near the earth to touch their harps of gold. I remember singing those words at Christmas 1957 in my student days. It was just after Sputnik 1 had gone up, and I suddenly felt a fool. Why was I celebrating a world that had passed away centuries ago? And it's not only at Christmas that we feel the appropriateness of traditional religious language, but also at times of personal crisis. In such moments, we become aware both of the modern world's dependence on science and of our continuing need of religion. But how do we fit those two thoughts together? I faced this question when, in the early 60s, I was a curate in Salford. Our last duty each evening was to go round the wards of this hospital, talking to patients about whatever they wanted to talk about. Now, the hospital itself is, of course, entirely based on modern, secular, scientific medicine. But many patients wanted to discuss their illness as a religious problem. A man dying of cancer said, "Why is this happening to me?" A woman who'd given birth to a handicapped child thought that God must be punishing her. Someone facing an operation said, "Pray that I won't have to go through with it." Once I prayed with the relatives over a man with a brain tumor, and he subsequently recovered. They were convinced that it had been a miracle. I was stumped by many of the things that people said to me. Of course, it's natural enough to respond in a religious way to a crisis in one's life. We all do. But people clearly expected me to endorse highly supernaturalist interpretations of their sickness and recovery. But does God really send disease as a warning or a punishment? as the prayer book says he does? And if God sometimes heals people in answer to prayer, why doesn't he do it more regularly? And if any of these supernatural interpretations of disease are correct, then what were we doing in a modern hospital, which is based on the idea that disease has natural causes and is controllable by human technology? In fact, of course, not even the most way-out religious conservative seriously thinks that we can give up modern medicine. The change since Pascal's time has been that science has moved more and more into the human sphere, and I was forced to try to work out an interpretation of what I was doing and what people were saying to me that was consistent with medical science. I think in those days I was already beginning to move away from the idea that religion offers a rival explanation of events or an auxiliary technology to be brought in when the doctors have failed. No, it's something quite different from that. I thought about the problem one night when I was called over here to a deathbed at 3 in the morning. There were no relatives present, and the patient was alone and already unconscious. He lived only a few minutes. I gave him absolution and said the prescribed prayers. Afterwards, I asked myself what I'd done. It hadn't made any scientifically measurable difference to him. I didn't suppose that I'd magically altered his eternal destiny from what it would otherwise have been. Yet I felt it had been worthwhile turning out, and hoped that when my time came, someone else would do the same for me. It seemed to me then as if religion was a way of affirming the value of human life from the first breath to the very last. It's up to us to give it that value, to affirm human dignity in the face of the indifferent universe.